London, 1736. The most powerful city in the world erupts in chaos. Not over politics, not over religion, over a clear liquid that costs less than a loaf of bread. This is the story of how gin nearly destroyed London, and how Londoners fought back when the government tried to take it away. Welcome to the Gin Act Wars, the most violent urban uprising Britain had seen in decades, all triggered by the government's attempt to control a nation's drinking habits. By 1736, London consumed 11 million gallons of gin annually. That's nearly 2 gallons for every man, woman, and child in the city. Children as young as 8 were drinking alongside adults. Entire families spent their last pennies on gin. The city was literally drinking itself to death. But when Parliament tried to stop this liquid madness, they discovered something terrifying. Londoners would rather fight than give up their gin. What followed were riots, underground resistance, and a battle for the very soul of Britain's greatest city. To understand why ordinary people became rebels over a bottle of gin, we must travel back to where this story truly begins, not in London's slums, but in the royal palaces of a Dutch king who changed England forever. Our story begins in 1688 with William of Orange, the Dutch king who became King of England. William brought more than just Protestant rule to Britain. He brought a love of gin that would transform the nation. William needed money for his wars against France. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Tax French brandy heavily and make gin production practically free. It was economic warfare disguised as domestic policy. In 1690, William passed an act for encouraging the distilling of brandy and spirits from corn. Suddenly, anyone could distill gin with just a small license fee. No training required, no quality control, no questions asked. Within a decade, London was flooded with thousands of new distillers. Gin became cheaper than milk, cheaper than tea, often cheaper than clean water. A gallon of gin cost just 2 shillings, less than a day's wages for a laborer. But William's gin policy unleashed consequences he never imagined, because in the overcrowded slums of rapidly expanding London, cheap gin wasn't just a drink, it was liquid desperation in a bottle. By 1720, London had become the gin capital of the world. But this wasn't the refined gin we know today. This was raw, harsh spirits, often flavored with anything available: turpentine, sulfuric acid, even sawdust. It was poison disguised as pleasure, and London's poorest residents couldn't get enough of it. To understand why, we must descend into the dark heart of Georgian London, the gin cellars where thousands gathered daily to drink away their sorrows and forget the unforgiving reality of their lives. Welcome to St. Giles, London's most notorious slum. In cellars barely fit for animals, thousands gathered daily to drink gin and forget their troubles. These weren't social drinking establishments. These were refuges from despair. The signs outside these gin cellars advertised their brutal honesty: drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2pence, clean straw for nothing. For a single penny, less than the cost of a piece of bread, you could achieve complete intoxication. But who were these desperate drinkers flooding London's gin cellars? They were the casualties of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Rural workers who had flocked to London seeking opportunity, only to find poverty, overcrowding, and despair. London's population had exploded from 500,000 to nearly 700,000 in just 30 years. Housing was scarce, wages were low, and opportunities were few. Families of 6 or more crammed into single rooms. Children worked 14-hour days in dangerous factories. Death was a constant companion. For these people, gin wasn't recreation, it was medicine for the soul. It numbed hunger, cold, and hopelessness. It provided a brief escape from lives that offered little hope and less comfort. Contemporary accounts describe entire families spending their last pennies on gin, mothers selling their children's clothes for drink money, pregnant women consuming gin daily, creating a generation born already dependent on alcohol. The statistics are horrifying. In some London parishes, infant mortality reached 75%. Many babies were born with what doctors called gin fits, withdrawal symptoms from their mother's drinking. The phrase mother's ruin wasn't just a nickname for gin, it was a literal description. By 1730, London had roughly 7,000 gin shops, one for every 75 residents. In the poorest neighborhoods, like St. Giles and Seven Dials, the ratio was even higher. Some streets had more gin sellers than any other type of business combined. But this gin-soaked paradise was about to face its greatest threat, because in the halls of Parliament, politicians were finally waking up to the monster they had created, and their solution would trigger the most violent urban uprising Britain had seen in decades. A report lands on the desk of Prime Minister Robert Walpole that changes everything. London's bills of mortality, the city's official death records, paint a picture of a metropolis destroying itself. 7,000 gin shops operating in London, 1 in 4 houses selling gin in poor districts, 14,000 recorded gin-related deaths annually. Crime rates doubled in gin-heavy neighborhoods. The numbers were staggering, but the stories behind them were even worse. London's magistrates reported courts clogged with gin-related crimes, workhouses overflowing with gin-soaked paupers, entire neighborhoods where normal life had simply ceased to exist. In St. Giles, there was 1 gin shop for every 15 residents. Children were routinely seen drinking alongside adults. Women gave birth in gin cellars. The dead were sometimes left lying for days because everyone was too intoxicated to notice. London's magistrates sent desperate letters to Parliament. The consumption of gin has increased to such a degree, wrote the Westminster magistrates in 1735, that unless speedily remedied, it will destroy the morals, health, and industry of the common people. Enter Sir Joseph Jekyll, the MP who would become gin's greatest enemy. Jekyll lived in Westminster, right next to some of the worst gin-infested areas. He had witnessed firsthand what gin was doing to London. He saw children begging for pennies to buy gin instead of food. He saw mothers choosing gin over milk for their babies. He saw families destroying themselves for a drink that cost less than a loaf of bread. Jekyll convinced Parliament that drastic action was needed. The gin trade, he argued, was not just destroying individual lives, it was threatening the very fabric of British society. His solution was radical, punitive, and would soon prove catastrophically misjudged. Parliament was about to discover that Londoners would rather fight than give up their gin. The Gin Act Wars were about to begin. September 29th, 1736. King George II signs into law an act for laying a duty upon retailers of spirituous liquors. History would remember it simply as the Gin Act, and it was designed to destroy London's gin trade overnight. The law was devastating in its scope. Gin retailers now had to pay £50 annually for a license, equivalent to about £8,000 today. Most gin sellers earned less than £20 per year, making legal operation impossible. But that wasn't all. The Act also imposed a tax of 20 shillings per gallon, making gin 6 times more expensive overnight. A drink that had cost a penny now cost 6 pence, beyond the reach of London's poorest residents. Parliament thought they were being clever. Make gin so expensive that people couldn't afford it, and the problem would solve itself. They had completely misunderstood both the nature of addiction and the desperation of London's gin-drinking population. There was one more provision that would prove to be the law's fatal flaw. Anyone providing information about illegal gin sales would receive half the fine as a reward, sometimes several pounds for a single successful prosecution. Parliament had just turned neighbor against neighbor, creating an army of informants motivated by money. In neighborhoods where a day's wages might be 6 pence, the prospect of earning several pounds for reporting gin sales was irresistible to some. The government expected compliance. Instead, they got defiance on a scale they never imagined. Within weeks of the act taking effect, an underground gin economy emerged that was more sophisticated and dangerous than anything that had existed before. Gin was sold from baby bottles to avoid detection, hidden in water barrels and tea caddies, dispensed through holes in walls, sold under ridiculous names like parliamentary brandy and my lady's eye water. The creativity was remarkable, but so was the violence. Because when you turn people into spies against their neighbors in communities already devastated by poverty and desperation, bloodshed inevitably follows. London was about to explode, and the first casualty would be a man named Thomas Wilson, an informant who thought he could profit from his neighbor's misery. October 1736. Just days after the Gin Act takes effect, London experiences its first gin riot. The target is Thomas Wilson, an informant who had reported several gin cellars in Spitalfields for the reward money. When word spread that Wilson had betrayed his neighbors for government gold, hundreds of residents surrounded his house. The magistrate's report describes a mob of nearly 500 people, quote, threatening to pull down the informant's house and do him bodily harm, unquote. This was just the beginning. Across London, informants found themselves targets of increasingly violent attacks. The underground gin trade had its own code of justice, and betrayal was the ultimate crime. What's remarkable is how organized the resistance became. Gin-selling communities developed warning systems to alert each other of raids. They created protection networks for targeted sellers. They even established informal courts to judge suspected informants. In these tight-knit neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone, informants couldn't hide. When your neighbor suddenly had extra money after reporting gin sales, people noticed, and they remembered. The most famous case involved Captain Dudley Bradstreet, a professional informant who made a fortune reporting gin cellars. Bradstreet was brilliant but ruthless, developing an elaborate system of disguises and false identities to gather evidence. Bradstreet would pose as a laborer seeking gin, then return with magistrates to arrest the seller. He appeared as a gentleman buying gifts, a beggar seeking charity, even a pregnant woman desperate for drink. His success rate was remarkable and made him London's most wanted man. By winter 1736, there was effectively a price on Bradstreet's head. Mobs actively hunted him through London streets. He moved houses frequently, traveled with bodyguards, and never appeared in public without disguise. The irony was perfect. The government had created a law to bring order to London's gin trade. Instead, they had created chaos. Violence was escalating. The gin trade was more organized than ever, and informants lived in constant fear. But London's gin sellers were about to discover a loophole that would make the Gin Act completely unenforceable. And their solution would turn the government's war on gin into a laughingstock. If Parliament thought London's gin sellers would simply surrender, they had badly underestimated their creativity. Since they couldn't legally sell gin, they would sell something else entirely. The names were absolutely absurd. My lady's eye water, the King of France's cordial, parliamentary gin, cuckold's comfort, Bob's medicine. Technically, they weren't selling gin at all. They were selling these mysteriously named liquids that just happened to taste exactly like gin. The law had specified gin by name, but these creative entrepreneurs found dozens of ways around it. Since the act only prohibited the sale of gin, selling Lady's Delight or King Theodore of Corsica's cordial was perfectly legal. The authorities were powerless. They could watch obvious gin transactions taking place, but as long as the bottles weren't labeled gin, no law was being broken. The Gin Act was being made ridiculous by creative labeling. But the most ingenious scheme belonged to a woman known only as Madame Geneva, gin's underground queen, whose real identity remains a mystery to this day. Madame Geneva ran the largest illegal gin distribution network in London. She employed dozens of sellers, used coded signals between different locations, and maintained safe houses throughout the city. Her operation was so sophisticated that it included lookouts, corrupt officials on her payroll, and an intelligence network that often knew about raids before they happened. Her bottles bore labels like Geneva Medicine and Madame G's Cordial for ladies. Everyone knew what they contained, but the authorities couldn't prove it was gin. Her network moved thousands of gallons weekly while remaining completely legal under the Act's specific wording. The Gin Act had created exactly what it was meant to prevent: a professional criminal organization built around alcohol. But these weren't violent criminals, they were community heroes, providing what people desperately wanted while outwitting an unpopular government. By 1737, it was clear the Gin Act was failing spectacularly. Gin consumption hadn't decreased, it had gone underground and become more profitable than ever. The law had turned ordinary shopkeepers into folk heroes and made the government look foolish. Parliament faced a choice: admit their first attempt had failed and try a different approach, or double down on enforcement with even harsher penalties. Unfortunately for London, they chose to double down. What happened next would transform London's gin resistance from clever evasion into open warfare. Spring 1737. Humiliated by the Gin Act's obvious failure, London magistrates launched the most aggressive enforcement campaign in the city's history. If clever loopholes were making the law unenforceable, they would crush the gin trade through sheer force. The new strategy was simple and brutal: mass arrests, property seizures, public prosecutions designed to terrorize gin sellers into compliance. They would make examples of violators so severe that others would abandon the trade entirely. The crackdown targeted not just obvious gin sellers, but anyone suspected of supporting the underground trade. Customers were arrested, lookouts were prosecuted. Even people who simply stood near gin shops faced questioning and potential charges. Constables broke down doors without warning. They confiscated bottles, scales, money, and anything else that might be connected to gin sales. Entire families found themselves homeless when their properties were seized as proceeds of illegal trade. What the authorities didn't anticipate was how these communities would respond to what they saw as an unprovoked assault on their way of life and survival. The enforcement campaign had an unintended consequence. It united London's fragmented gin communities against a common enemy: the government itself. Neighborhoods that had competed with each other now shared information, resources, and protection. These weren't political revolutionaries or criminal masterminds. They were ordinary people, mothers, laborers, small shopkeepers, who felt their basic freedoms were being destroyed. Gin wasn't just their escape anymore, it had become their right. The first major confrontation came during the trial of Mary Roberts, a gin seller from Shoreditch who had been arrested in a dramatic early morning raid that terrified her entire neighborhood. Mary Roberts became a symbol of everything wrong with the government's approach. She was a working mother trying to feed her family by selling what had been perfectly legal just months before. Her customers were neighbors and friends, not criminals. As Roberts' trial began, something unprecedented happened. Nearly 1,000 supporters gathered outside the courthouse demanding her release. They carried signs, chanted slogans, and made it clear they would not accept her imprisonment quietly. The authorities realized they had made a critical error. They weren't just prosecuting in. When Mary Roberts was sentenced to 6 months in prison, London's gin wars entered their most violent phase. The crowd didn't just protest, they exploded. July 15, 1737. What began as a peaceful protest outside Shoreditch Courthouse explodes into London's most violent gin riot yet. The Mary Roberts verdict was the spark, but the fuel had been building for months. These people felt completely betrayed by their own government. They had watched their communities destroyed by poverty, turned to gin for comfort, seen their neighbors imprisoned for providing what everyone desperately needed. Within hours, the riot had spread far beyond the courthouse. This wasn't random violence. It was targeted political action with specific goals and carefully chosen targets. The rioters had prepared lists of people they considered enemies of their community. Gin informants topped the list, followed by corrupt officials, magistrates involved in enforcement, and anyone who had profited from the Gin Act's punitive measures. The most dramatic moment came when the crowd reached the house of Thomas Wilson, the same informant who had triggered the first gin riot the previous year. Wilson had continued his informant activities despite the earlier threats, apparently believing the authorities could protect him. Wilson barely escaped with his life, fleeing through a back window as the front of his house came under attack. The crowd completely destroyed his property, and when they finished, they painted a message on the ruins that would be remembered for decades. Death to gin spies. But Wilson's house was just the beginning. The riot continued through the night, targeting every symbol of the Gin Act's authority. Magistrates' offices were ransacked. Court records were burned in the streets. Even the courthouse itself was severely damaged. Contemporary accounts described the crowd's fury as terrible to behold. One observer wrote, "They seemed possessed by a righteous anger against all who would deny them their liquor. Nothing could stand before their wrath." The Shoreditch uprising lasted 3 full days. When it finally ended, dozens were injured, property damage reached thousands of pounds, and London's authorities faced an uncomfortable truth they could no longer ignore. They had created the very lawlessness they claimed to be fighting. The Gin Act hadn't reduced crime or restored order. It had caused the worst urban violence London had seen in living memory. But instead of reconsidering their approach, Parliament's response proved they had learned nothing from the disaster. They decided the problem wasn't the Gin Act itself, it was that the penalties weren't severe enough. The government was about to make their biggest mistake yet. October 1737, just months after the Shoreditch riots. Parliament passes the Second Gin Act, making the penalties for illegal gin sales even more severe. The lesson they took from London's violence was that they hadn't been tough enough. The Second Act was vindictive in its scope. Prison sentences doubled. Fines increased dramatically. Most controversially, it introduced collective punishment. If multiple gin cellars operated in one area, entire neighborhoods could face increased taxes, surveillance, and restrictions. Under the new law, if 3 or more gin cellars were discovered on a single street, every resident could be subject to special taxes, curfews, and constant official harassment. It was collective punishment designed to turn communities against their own gin cellars. But London's gin communities had learned valuable lessons from Shoreditch. Their resistance would no longer be spontaneous riots driven by anger. It would be organized, sophisticated, and more effective than the government could possibly imagine. The Second Gin Act created something unprecedented in British history. An organized urban resistance movement united around alcohol rights. What emerged was a sophisticated network that spanned the entire city. Gin sellers, distributors, lookouts, and protectors formed cells that communicated through coded messages and hand signals. They developed their own intelligence networks to identify informants and corrupt officials. Most importantly, they created mutual protection agreements. Attack one gin community, face retaliation from all. They established safe houses for gin storage and distribution, created fake businesses as fronts for gin operations, developed elaborate warning systems using church bells, street vendors, and even children's games to alert of approaching raids. The resistance also turned to psychological warfare. Informants found threatening messages left at their homes. Officials faced constant harassment and social isolation. Even magistrates discovered that their own servants and tradesmen might be part of the gin network. But the most brilliant aspect of their resistance was legal. They recruited sympathetic lawyers who found new loopholes in the Second Act faster than Parliament could close them. Every arrest led to technical challenges, procedural delays, and creative interpretations of the law. By early 1738, London's gin resistance had evolved into something remarkable, a shadow government that provided what people needed while completely undermining official authority. The Second Gin Act wasn't just failing, it was making the resistance stronger. Parliament was about to discover that when you wage war on your own people's basic desires, you create enemies far more dangerous than the problems you were trying to solve. Spring 1738, Captain Dudley Bradstreet, London's most notorious gin informant, decides to strike back at his tormentors with the most elaborate deception in gin war history. If the resistance wanted to play games, he would show them what a professional could accomplish. Bradstreet had been forced into hiding by constant death threats. His previous house had been burned, his family had fled London, but instead of giving up, he decided to turn his fugitive status into an advantage. Working with a small team of paid informants, Bradstreet developed Operation Gin Palace, a scheme to expose the entire underground network by creating a fake gin operation so attractive that every major player would want to join. Bradstreet rented a large cellar in Whitechapel and began spreading rumors about a new gin operation run by mysterious foreign investors. The prices would be lower than anywhere else, the quality superior, and most importantly, they had government protection. The bait was irresistible. Within weeks, representatives from every major gin network in London had made contact. They wanted to buy in bulk, establish distribution agreements, share protection resources. What they didn't know was that every conversation was being recorded, every meeting was witnessed by hidden informants, every transaction provided evidence for mass prosecutions. The climax came in May 1738 when Bradstreet invited all the major gin network leaders to a grand meeting to discuss dividing London into territories. Over 50 of the most wanted gin criminals in London gathered in his cellar. At a predetermined signal, dozens of constables surrounded the building. The entire leadership of London's gin resistance was captured in one coordinated raid. It should have been the end of the gin wars. But Bradstreet had underestimated how deeply the gin networks had penetrated London society. Within hours of the arrests, the resistance struck back with coordinated attacks across the city. Magistrates' offices were ransacked, court records were burned in the streets, even the courthouse itself was severely damaged. The message was clear: attack the gin networks, face total war. Parliament realized they had created an enemy they couldn't defeat through conventional law enforcement. By late 1738, the Gin Acts had produced exactly the opposite of their intended effect. Gin consumption was higher than ever. Violence was constant. Respect for authority had collapsed in large parts of London. Most importantly, the gin resistance had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple alcohol smuggling. They had become an alternative power structure that commanded more loyalty in many neighborhoods than the official government. Parliament faced a choice: escalate the conflict into open civil war or find a completely different approach to the gin problem. Fortunately for London, they finally chose wisdom over stubbornness. December 1738. Behind closed doors in Westminster, Parliament finally admits what everyone else already knew. The gin acts had been a catastrophic failure. The cure had proven worse than the disease. The statistics were undeniable. Gin consumption had actually increased during the enforcement period. Violence was at unprecedented levels. Large parts of London were effectively ungovernable. The government had spent enormous sums and achieved nothing except making enemies of their own citizens. Sir Joseph Jekyll, the architect of the original Gin Act, privately admitted his approach had been a mistake of considerable magnitude. Other MPs spoke of unintended consequences and the need for different strategies. But they faced a political problem. How do you admit such a massive policy failure without losing all credibility? The solution was typically British. They would change course while pretending they had always intended to do so. The first step was quietly abandoning enforcement. Raids stopped almost overnight. Prosecutions were delayed indefinitely. Magistrates received private instructions to focus on other crimes and ignore minor gin violations. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Violence decreased rapidly as communities no longer felt under siege. The underground networks began dissolving as legal alternatives became available again. But Parliament needed to do more than just stop enforcing failed laws. They needed to create a new approach that actually worked. The solution would come from an unexpected source: the gin sellers themselves. In early 1739, government representatives began secret negotiations with leaders of the former gin resistance. These weren't criminals anymore. They were experienced business people who understood the market better than anyone. The deal they worked out was revolutionary for its time. Instead of prohibition and punishment, they would try regulation and taxation at realistic levels. Gin would be legal again, but controlled through licensing, quality standards, and reasonable taxes that people could actually afford. Most importantly, former gin resistance members would be given first priority for new legal licenses. The government was effectively hiring their former enemies to help solve the problem they had created. The transformation was remarkable. People who had been hunted as criminals months before were now licensed businesses contributing taxes to the treasury. Former informants and resistance fighters worked side by side in the new regulatory system. By mid-1739, London had achieved something unprecedented: a working compromise between government control and popular demand. The gin wars were officially over. 13 years after the gin wars ended, Parliament passes what historians call the Jekyll Gin Act, named after the same man who had authored the failed laws of the 1730s. But this time, Jekyll had learned from his mistakes. The new law represented a complete philosophical reversal. Instead of trying to eliminate gin consumption, it sought to control and improve it. Instead of punitive taxes that encouraged crime, it imposed moderate duties that people could afford. Most importantly, the 1751 Act focused on quality rather than quantity. Licensed gin had to meet specific standards. Sellers needed proper training. Dangerous additives were prohibited. The goal was safer gin, not no gin. Jekyll's transformation from prohibitionist to pragmatist reflected a broader change in British thinking about government and individual liberty. The gin wars had taught a valuable lesson: laws that ignore human nature are destined to fail. In his private papers, Jekyll wrote, "We learned that the people's will, when denied, becomes a force more powerful than government itself. Better to guide that force than to oppose it uselessly." The 1751 Act was everything the earlier laws were not: moderate, practical, and respectful of popular sentiment. It worked because it accepted human nature rather than trying to change it. Within 5 years, gin consumption had stabilized at manageable levels. quality improved dramatically. Violence disappeared almost entirely. Most importantly, respect for law and government was restored in neighborhoods that had been in rebellion for years. The success was so complete that the 1751 model became the template for alcohol regulation throughout the British Empire and beyond. Many of its principles still influence modern alcohol policy today. But the gin wars had changed more than just alcohol policy. They had demonstrated that ordinary people, when pushed too far, could organize effective resistance against government overreach. This lesson would prove valuable in future political struggles. The organizational skills, resistance networks, and political consciousness developed during the Gin Wars didn't disappear. They evolved and would resurface in later conflicts over taxation, representation, and individual rights. The lessons of London's Gin Wars crossed the Atlantic with British colonists, creating unexpected parallels in America's relationship with British authority. The organization methods and resistance strategies developed in London's gin cellars would find new life in American taverns and meeting halls. American colonists had watched the gin wars with great interest. Many were recent immigrants who remembered the chaos in London firsthand. They understood exactly what happened when British authorities tried to impose unpopular taxes and regulations. When Britain began imposing new taxes on the American colonies in the 1760s, the response was remarkably similar to London's gin resistance: secret networks, coded communications, coordinated boycotts, and protection for those who defied British authority. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was essentially a gin war tactic applied to tea: destroy the government's ability to profit from unpopular taxation through coordinated resistance and community solidarity. Even the language was similar. American revolutionaries called tax collectors informants and spies. They used the same tactics of social isolation, economic boycotts, and targeted harassment that London gin communities had perfected. The organizational structure of American resistance, cells communicating through coded messages, safe houses for contraband, community protection for resistors, was almost identical to what had developed during the Gin Wars. Most tellingly, when American revolutionaries wrote their complaints against British rule, many echoed the grievances London gin sellers had voiced decades earlier: taxation without representation, punitive enforcement, collective punishment of communities. The British government made the same mistakes in America they had made with gin, underestimating popular resistance, relying on informants and harsh enforcement, and refusing to compromise until it was too late. In a very real sense, the American Revolution was the Gin Wars writ large. The same conflict between government authority and popular will, played out on a continental scale with permanent consequences for the British Empire. Behind every gin riot, beneath every act of resistance, stood the women whose lives had been most devastated by both gin addiction and government persecution. Their stories reveal the human cost of London's liquid civil war. Women dominated London's gin trade at every level, as sellers, distributors, customers, and victims. In neighborhoods where men's employment was uncertain, women often became the primary breadwinners through gin sales. Mary Roberts, whose imprisonment sparked the Shoreditch Uprising, was typical of thousands of women caught between poverty and prohibition. Widowed at 30 with 4 children, she turned to gin sales when no other work was available. But women didn't just sell gin, they led the resistance against the Gin Acts. The mysterious Madame Geneva was just the most famous of dozens of women who organized sophisticated smuggling networks. Women created the warning systems that protected gin sellers from raids. They developed the coded language and signals that allowed the trade to continue. They maintained the safe houses and distribution networks that kept gin flowing despite government efforts. Perhaps most importantly, women bore the greatest cost of the gin epidemic. Contemporary accounts describe mothers choosing gin over food for their children, pregnant women drinking heavily, and babies born already dependent on alcohol. The phrase "mother's ruin" wasn't just gin's nickname, it was a literal description of what the drink did to families. Parish records from gin-heavy neighborhoods show infant mortality rates that are almost incomprehensible today. Yet these same women who suffered most from gin also fought hardest to protect their right to sell it. For them, the choice wasn't between gin and sobriety, it was between gin sales and starvation. When Mary Roberts was sentenced to prison, it was women who led the protests that became the Shoreditch riots. When informants were attacked, women often organized and directed the violence. When the underground networks needed coordination, women provided the leadership. The gin wars revealed something that British society wasn't ready to acknowledge: that women could be just as politically organized, just as capable of resistance, and just as willing to fight for their rights as men. This lesson, like so many others from the gin wars, would resurface in later struggles for women's rights, workers' rights, and social justice. The organizational skills women developed selling gin illegally would serve them well in future political battles. While politicians fought over gin policy, London's doctors faced an unprecedented medical crisis. They were seeing diseases and symptoms they had never encountered, the result of mass consumption of industrial alcohol mixed with unknown chemicals. Georgian gin wasn't the refined spirit we know today. It was industrial alcohol flavored with whatever was available: turpentine for juniper taste, sulfuric acid for bite, alum for clarity, even sawdust for body. The health effects were catastrophic and mysterious. Dr. Stephen Hales, one of London's leading physicians, documented symptoms he called gin madness: violent behavior, hallucinations, and physical deterioration that progressed faster than any known disease. The most tragic cases involved pregnant women. Babies were born with what doctors called gin fits, withdrawal symptoms that could last weeks. Many infants died within days of birth, their tiny bodies unable to survive without the alcohol they had received in the womb. Dr. Hales began keeping detailed records of gin-related medical cases. His findings were shocking. Gin drinkers aged faster, died younger, and suffered from organ damage that seemed to accelerate with each passing month. But the medical establishment was divided on solutions. Some doctors argued for complete prohibition, believing gin was essentially poison that should be banned entirely. Others advocated for regulation and quality control, arguing that safer gin was better than illegal gin. Dr. Hales found himself caught in the middle. As a physician, he saw gin's devastating health effects daily. But as a social observer, he understood that prohibition had made the problem worse by encouraging consumption of even more dangerous illegal varieties. His solution was revolutionary for its time: treat gin addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing or criminal act. He established London's first treatment facility for chronic gin users, focusing on gradual reduction rather than immediate cessation. Hales discovered that sudden gin withdrawal could be fatal, the first documented case of alcohol withdrawal being recognized as a medical emergency. His gradual reduction methods saved hundreds of lives. The medical lessons learned during the gin epidemic laid the groundwork for modern understanding of addiction, withdrawal, and treatment. Hales' work influenced addiction medicine for centuries and established important principles still used today. But perhaps most importantly, the medical crisis of the gin wars demonstrated that public health problems require public health solutions, not just legal and moral responses. This insight would prove crucial in addressing future epidemics and social health challenges. The most heartbreaking aspect of London's gin epidemic was its impact on children. An entire generation grew up in gin-soaked neighborhoods where alcohol was more available than milk, more affordable than bread, and more common than clean water. Contemporary accounts describe children as young as 8 drinking regularly alongside adults. Parish school records show massive increases in truancy as children spent days in gin cellars rather than classrooms. But children weren't just victims of the gin epidemic. They became active participants in the underground economy it created. They served as lookouts during gin sales, carried coded messages between sellers, and even made transactions themselves to avoid adult prosecution. Thomas Coram, founder of London's Foundling Hospital, documented the crisis in heartbreaking detail. His records show hundreds of children abandoned by gin-addicted parents, often found unconscious in cellars or wandering streets while their parents drank. The most tragic cases involved children born to chronic gin users. These babies often suffered from what we now recognize as fetal alcohol syndrome, developmental delays, physical deformities, and behavioral problems that followed them throughout life. But even in this darkness, children showed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They developed their own networks of mutual support, sharing food and shelter when adults were too intoxicated to care for them. During the gin wars, children served as crucial intelligence gatherers. They could move through neighborhoods without suspicion, overhear adult conversations, and report on informant activities. Their information often prevented raids and protected gin sellers. The resistance movements recognized children's value and developed systems to protect them. Safe houses specifically for children, educational programs run by gin sellers, even primitive medical care provided by the underground networks. When Mary Roberts was arrested, it was partly the testimony of children in her neighborhood that sparked the outrage leading to riots. They described her as a protector who fed hungry children and provided shelter for those with nowhere else to go. The gin wars revealed that children could be remarkably adaptable and politically aware. Many who survived the epidemic became activists in later social reform movements, carrying forward the organizational skills and resistance mentalities they had learned. Their experiences would influence child protection laws, education reform, and social welfare policies for generations. The children of Gin Lane became the advocates for future generations of vulnerable youth. While politicians debated morality and doctors treated medical emergencies, the gin wars were fundamentally about economics, the collision between government policy and market forces that refused to be denied. The underground gin economy during Prohibition was remarkably sophisticated. Economists today estimate it generated between 2 and 3 million pounds annually, roughly equivalent to 400 million pounds in modern currency. This wasn't just small-scale neighborhood selling. The gin resistance operated like a modern corporation, with specialized roles, supply chains, quality control, and even customer service. They had purchasing agents, warehouse managers, and regional distribution networks. The profit margins were extraordinary. Legal gin cost 20 shillings per gallon after the Gin Act. Underground gin could be produced and sold for 3 to 4 shillings while still generating enormous profits for everyone involved. But the economics went beyond simple profit. The gin trade provided employment for thousands of people who had few other options: widows, disabled workers, immigrants, and anyone excluded from traditional trades. Mary Roberts, for example, supported 4 children on earnings from gin sales that were 3 times what she could make from any legal employment available to women. For her, the Gin Act wasn't just prohibition, it was economic destruction. The government had created a situation where breaking the law was not just profitable, but necessary for survival. This economic reality made enforcement almost impossible. You can't arrest an entire economy. The underground economy also generated significant tax revenue through indirect means. Gin sellers spent their profits on food, clothing, housing, and other goods, all of which were taxed. The government was actually profiting from the illegal trade they claimed to oppose. Landlords rented properties to gin sellers, suppliers provided bottles, corks, and flavoring agents, transport workers moved illegal gin, lawyers defended arrested sellers. The entire London economy was partially dependent on illegal gin. When enforcement crackdowns disrupted gin operations, the effects rippled through the broader economy. Legitimate businesses saw decreased spending, tax revenues declined, employment opportunities disappeared. The government eventually realized they were fighting not just gin sellers, but economic reality itself. The 1751 Gin Act worked because it accepted market forces rather than trying to eliminate them. The gin wars demonstrated a fundamental economic principle that governments ignore at their peril. When you make profitable activities illegal, you don't eliminate the profits, you just transfer them to criminals. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly in future prohibition efforts involving alcohol, drugs, and other commodities that governments attempt to ban, but populations continue to demand. The gin wars weren't just political and economic, they were cultural, inspiring artists, writers, and social critics to document and interpret one of the most dramatic social upheavals in British history. William Hogarth's Gin Lane became the most famous artistic response to the gin epidemic, but it was just one of dozens of cultural works inspired by the crisis. The image of a gin-mad mother dropping her baby while reaching for a bottle became an enduring symbol of social decay. But Hogarth wasn't just documenting the problem, he was taking sides. His parallel engraving, Beer Street, showed orderly, prosperous people enjoying traditional English ale, making clear his preference for beer over gin. The cultural battle over gin extended far beyond Hogarth. Pamphleteers wrote dozens of works arguing both for and against gin consumption. Religious leaders preached sermons comparing gin to various biblical plagues. Popular songs emerged celebrating gin sellers as folk heroes. The gin wars also produced some of Britain's first protest literature written from the perspective of working-class participants. Broadsides and pamphlets defended gin sellers as honest traders persecuted by unjust laws. These publications were often crude and simple, but they represented something new. Ordinary people using print media to argue their political positions directly rather than relying on educated intermediaries. The gin epidemic also influenced popular entertainment. Puppet shows, street performances, and tavern songs celebrated gin sellers as romantic outlaws fighting government tyranny. The most popular songs portrayed informants as villains and gin sellers as heroes. Theater was transformed as well. New plays emerged featuring gin sellers as sympathetic protagonists struggling against corrupt officials and heartless informants. These productions were wildly popular in working-class neighborhoods. The cultural impact extended to language itself. Terms like mother's ruin, gin palace, and dead drunk entered permanent English usage. The phrase to inform became associated with betrayal rather than simply providing information. Religious culture was deeply affected as well. Some denominations embraced temperance as a core principle, while others focused on social justice issues highlighted by the gin crisis. The epidemic sparked theological debates about government authority, personal responsibility, and social obligation. Perhaps most importantly, the gin wars established a cultural template for understanding conflicts between authority and popular will. The image of ordinary people resisting government overreach became a powerful cultural symbol that would resurface in later political struggles. The cultural productions of the Gin Wars created a shared narrative about resistance to unjust authority that transcended the specific issue of alcohol regulation. This cultural framework would prove influential far beyond the 18th century. London's gin wars didn't happen in isolation. Across Europe, governments were grappling with similar problems as distilled spirits became cheaper and more widely available. Britain's experience became both cautionary tale and instruction manual for other nations. In Amsterdam, where gin originated, authorities watched the London riots with growing alarm. Dutch gin consumption was also rising rapidly, and local officials feared similar uprisings if they attempted British-style prohibition. The Dutch solution was characteristically pragmatic: heavy regulation rather than prohibition, with quality standards enforced through guild systems that had controlled other trades for centuries. The result was expensive but safe gin that avoided both the health crisis and political upheaval that plagued London. In France, where brandy was the preferred spirit, officials used London's example to justify protective tariffs against foreign alcohol. The gin wars became a propaganda tool for French trade policy, proof that cheap foreign spirits destroyed social order. German states took yet another approach, using London's example to justify state monopolies on spirit production and distribution. If private enterprise led to chaos, then government control was the obvious solution. The American colonies watched the gin wars with particular interest, seeing parallels to their own struggles with British authority. Colonial newspapers reprinted accounts of London riots alongside complaints about British taxing policies. Benjamin Franklin, writing from London during part of the gin crisis, observed that the people's resistance to unjust laws follows similar patterns whether the issue be spirits or stamps. His writings helped American colonists understand their own resistance movements in the context of broader struggles for popular rights. The gin wars also influenced international law and diplomacy. British negotiators found their authority diminished when foreign counterparts could point to domestic chaos and question Britain's ability to maintain order within its own borders. Perhaps most significantly, the gin wars demonstrated that social problems could cross national boundaries faster than political solutions. The same industrial processes making cheap gin available in London were operating across Europe and beyond. This international dimension forced governments to think beyond purely domestic solutions. The 1751 Gin Act's success made it a model copied throughout the British Empire and studied by officials across Europe. The Gin Wars revealed that in an increasingly connected world, social problems required international awareness and coordination even when solutions remained primarily domestic. This insight would prove valuable in addressing future challenges that crossed national boundaries. By the 1750s, the London Gin Wars had become part of European political consciousness, a shared reference point for discussing the relationship between government authority, popular will, and social order. The lessons learned would influence policy debates for generations. Walk through London today and you'll find gin bars on nearly every corner. Craft distillers proudly display their products. Gin has become a symbol of British sophistication rather than social chaos. But beneath this genteel surface lies one of the most important political lessons in British history. The organizational methods developed during the Gin Wars didn't disappear when the crisis ended. They evolved, adapted, and reappeared in every major social movement that followed. The Chartists of the 1840s used communication networks and coordinated resistance strategies that were virtually identical to those developed by gin sellers. The same coded messages, safe houses, and mutual protection agreements. The suffragette movement employed similar tactics: underground networks, coordinated actions, protection for activists facing government persecution, and the strategic use of civil disobedience to highlight unjust laws. Even modern trade union organizing reflects lessons learned in London's gin cellars. The importance of community solidarity, the need for secure communications, the power of economic pressure, and the effectiveness of targeted resistance. The civil rights movement, environmental activism, and contemporary protest movements all show traces of organizational DNA that can be traced back to London's gin sellers fighting for their economic survival and personal freedom. But the gin wars also offer important lessons for governments and policymakers. The failure of the original Gin Acts demonstrates what happens when laws ignore human nature, economic reality, and popular will. Prohibition-era America repeated many of the same errors: unrealistic expectations, punitive enforcement, creation of profitable criminal enterprises, and ultimate policy failure. The parallels are striking and instructive. Contemporary drug policy debates often reference the gin wars as an example of how prohibition can create more problems than it solves. The same economic incentives, enforcement challenges, and social consequences appear repeatedly. The gin wars also pioneered modern understanding of addiction as a medical rather than purely moral issue. Dr. Hale's treatment approaches influenced addiction medicine for centuries and established principles still used today. Perhaps most importantly, the gin wars demonstrated that ordinary people, when pushed too far by government overreach, can organize effective resistance that forces policy change. This lesson remains relevant in democratic societies worldwide. The gin wars proved that successful policy must balance competing interests: public health, individual freedom, economic reality, and social stability. The 1751 Compromise worked because it acknowledged all these factors rather than focusing solely on one. Today's policymakers studying issues like marijuana legalization, gambling regulation, or public health interventions often reference the gin wars as a case study in how to avoid policy disasters and achieve workable compromises. The legacy of London's gin wars extends far beyond alcohol policy. It lives on in every democratic society where citizens organize to resist laws they consider unjust, and in every government that learns to listen to popular concerns rather than simply imposing solutions from above. As we watch modern political upheavals around the world, the gin wars offer essential lessons about the relationship between government authority and popular will that remain urgently relevant today. The first lesson is about the power of economic incentives. When governments make profitable activities illegal, they don't eliminate the profits, they transfer them to criminal enterprises. This principle applies whether we're discussing gin in 1736, alcohol in 1920s America, or drugs today. The second lesson concerns enforcement. No law can be successfully enforced without substantial popular support. The gin wars demonstrated that even the most powerful government in the world cannot impose unpopular policies on unwilling populations indefinitely. The third lesson involves unintended consequences. Well-intentioned policies can create worse problems than they solve. The Gin Acts were designed to reduce social disorder, but actually increased violence, criminality, and disrespect for authority. The fourth lesson is about the importance of compromise and adaptation. The 1751 Gin Act succeeded because it accepted human nature and market forces rather than trying to eliminate them. Effective policy works with reality, not against it. The gin wars also teach us about the power of grassroots organization. Ordinary people facing common problems can create sophisticated resistance networks that challenge even the most established authorities. This power is neither inherently good nor bad, it's simply a political reality. Perhaps most importantly, the gin wars demonstrate that sustainable policy must address root causes rather than just symptoms. The gin epidemic reflected deeper problems: poverty, hopelessness, lack of opportunity. Successful solutions required addressing these underlying issues. These lessons apply to contemporary challenges ranging from immigration and drug policy to taxation and regulation. The gin wars remind us that policy success depends on understanding human nature, respecting economic reality, and maintaining popular legitimacy. They also remind us that democratic governments must be responsive to popular concerns. When significant portions of the population feel their basic needs and rights are being ignored, organized resistance becomes inevitable. The gin wars offer hope as well as warnings. They show that even the most intractable problems can be solved through patience, pragmatism, and a willingness to compromise. The transformation from chaos in 1736 to workable solutions in 1751 demonstrates that political systems can learn and adapt. Most encouragingly, the gin wars prove that ordinary people have more power than they often realize. The gin sellers who organized London's resistance weren't trained politicians or professional revolutionaries. They were shopkeepers, workers, and mothers fighting for their economic survival and personal freedom. Their success in forcing one of history's most powerful governments to completely reverse course demonstrates that popular will, when organized and sustained, remains the ultimate source of political authority in any society that claims to serve its people. The gin wars ended nearly 3 centuries ago, but their lessons remain as relevant as tomorrow's headlines. In every struggle between authority and freedom, between policymakers and those affected by their policies, the ghosts of London's gin sellers remind us that power ultimately belongs to the people if they have the courage to organize and use it. We began this journey in modern London, unaware of the violent history hidden beneath our feet. Now, as we conclude, those same streets tell a different story. One of ordinary people who changed the course of history through courage, organization, and refusal to accept injustice. Stand today in Spitalfields Market, and you're standing where Thomas Wilson fled for his life from an angry mob in 1736. Walk through Shoreditch, and you're retracing the steps of rioters who burned down informants' houses and challenged government authority. Visit St. Giles today, now cleaned up and gentrified, and try to imagine thousands of desperate people crowded into gin cellars, drinking away their sorrows while planning resistance against laws they considered unjust. The gin wars lasted just over a decade, but their impact shaped British society for centuries. They established principles about the relationship between government and citizens that influenced everything from workers' rights to women's suffrage to modern democratic governance. Perhaps most remarkably, the gin wars proved that violence and chaos aren't inevitable when government and citizens disagree. The successful resolution in 1751 demonstrated that even the most bitter conflicts can be resolved through compromise and mutual respect. The key was recognizing that both sides had legitimate interests. The government needed to maintain order and protect public health. The people needed economic opportunity and personal freedom. Success came from finding solutions that served both needs. This lesson remains urgently relevant in our polarized modern world. The gin wars remind us that sustainable solutions require understanding and respecting the concerns of all parties, not just imposing the will of whoever holds power at the moment. The gin wars also teach us about the importance of listening to grassroots voices. The politicians who designed the original gin acts never consulted the communities most affected. When they finally started listening to gin sellers and their customers, workable solutions became possible. Today's policymakers would benefit from remembering Mary Roberts, the gin seller whose imprisonment sparked the Shoreditch riots. She wasn't a criminal mastermind or political radical. She was a working mother trying to feed her children. When government policies made that impossible, she became a reluctant revolutionary. The gin wars remind us that behind every political conflict are real human beings with families to support, dreams to pursue, and dignity to maintain. Successful policy must acknowledge this human reality. As we walk through modern London's gin bars and craft distilleries, we should remember the price paid for today's orderly alcohol trade. Hundreds died in riots, thousands were imprisoned, families were destroyed, communities were torn apart. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The Gin Wars established that government authority must be earned through responsive policy, not simply imposed through force. They proved that ordinary people have the power to resist injustice and force political change. Most importantly, they demonstrated that even the most powerful governments must ultimately answer to the people they claim to serve. This principle, won through struggle in London's gin cellars and riot-torn streets, remains the foundation of democratic society. The Gin Wars ended with reconciliation rather than victory by either side. Former enemies became partners in building a system that served everyone's interests. This model of conflict resolution through compromise and mutual respect remains their greatest gift to future generations. So the next time you raise a glass of gin, whether in a London pub, a New York cocktail bar, or anywhere else in the world, remember the men and women who fought for the right to make that simple pleasure possible. Remember Mary Roberts and her children. Remember the anonymous heroes of the underground resistance. Remember the lesson that freedom is never given freely, but must always be earned through struggle. The Gin Wars proved that when ordinary people unite around common cause, they can move mountains, or at least move governments. That lesson echoes through history from 1736 to today, reminding each generation that democracy is not a spectator sport, but a participatory responsibility. The story of London's Gin Wars is ultimately about the eternal struggle between authority and freedom, between order and liberty, between the power of government and the will of the people. This struggle didn't end in 1751. It continues in every democracy, in every generation, wherever people seek to govern themselves. In every age, governments face the temptation to solve complex social problems through simple prohibition and punishment. In every age, people resist when those solutions ignore their basic needs and rights. The Gin Wars remind us that this cycle can be broken through wisdom, compromise, and mutual respect. The men and women who fought in London's Gin Wars would recognize the debates surrounding modern issues like drug policy, immigration, taxation, and regulation. The same fundamental tensions between individual freedom and social order play out in different contexts with similar dynamics. They would understand the frustration of people who feel their voices aren't heard by distant authorities. They would recognize the anger of communities that feel targeted and persecuted by policies they had no role in creating. But they would also recognize the hope inherent in democratic systems, the possibility that organized citizens can force policy change, that governments can learn from their mistakes, and that compromise can transform conflict into cooperation. The Gin Wars demonstrated that democracy is messy, contentious, and sometimes violent, but ultimately more effective than any alternative system for resolving disputes between government and citizens. Perhaps most importantly, the Gin Wars proved that freedom is not a gift granted by benevolent rulers, but a right that must be continuously defended by vigilant citizens. Every generation must earn its freedom anew through participation, organization, and, when necessary, resistance. The London gin sellers who rioted in 1737 couldn't have imagined that their struggle would influence American independence, workers' rights, women's suffrage, and countless other movements for justice and freedom. But their courage in standing up to unjust authority created ripples that continue to spread across time and space. Today, in courtrooms and legislatures around the world, lawyers and politicians still reference the Gin Wars when arguing about the proper balance between government authority and individual rights. The principles established in London's gin cellars continue to shape legal and political thinking centuries later. As we face contemporary challenges, from public health crises to economic inequality, to questions about government surveillance and control, the Gin Wars offer both warnings and hope. warnings about the dangers of ignoring popular will and economic reality, hope that even the most intractable problems can be solved through patience, wisdom, and good faith compromise. The ultimate message of the Jin Wars is that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they organize around shared principles and common cause. A group of London gin sellers facing government persecution became a movement that changed the course of British history and influenced democratic development worldwide. Their legacy reminds us that in any conflict between justice and injustice, between freedom and oppression, between the powerful and the powerless, the outcome is never predetermined. It depends on the courage and commitment of individuals who choose to stand up and be counted. The Jin Wars ended nearly 3 centuries ago, but their spirit lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who organizes for change, who believes that government should serve the people rather than the other way around. So as we conclude this long journey through London's most remarkable political upheaval, remember that you are part of this continuing story. The Jin Wars didn't end in 1751. They transformed into every subsequent struggle for justice, freedom, and democratic accountability. The next chapter is being written today by people like you, in communities around the world where citizens organize to hold their governments accountable and fight for the principles that matter most to human dignity and freedom. The gin sellers of London won their war not through violence or hatred, but through persistence, organization, and ultimate willingness to find common ground with their former enemies. Their victory belongs to all of us who believe that democracy, for all its flaws and challenges, remains humanity's best hope for creating just and free societies. In raising a glass to their memory, we commit ourselves to carrying forward their unfinished work, the endless, essential task of building and defending societies where government serves the people, where justice is pursued through law rather than force, and where ordinary citizens retain the power to demand change when their leaders lose their way. The Jin Wars are over. The struggle for freedom and justice continues. And in that continuing struggle, we are all inheritors of the courage shown by London's gin sellers when they dared to fight back against injustice and change the world.